both of these are what we call hugelkultur beds. This one is a raised hugelkultur bed, and this is a trough hugelkultur bed. And so the difference really is just that this one didn't go down as deep and got a little bit more on top, and this one went very deep and flat on top. For the desert climate that we live in, a raised hugelkultur bed is very difficult to maintain for annual culture, but it's not at all difficult to maintain for perennial culture. It is now fairly fully charged, meaning that all of the wood that's at the bottom, very bottom layer, is just really wet, growing fungal organisms. And that's why hugels are very good for our climate, is because they're fungally based. Yes.
Did you use logs or
Yes.
branches?
Logs. Big, huge cottonwood logs that had fallen in our stream. Yeah. And so there's one log in that one that's the length of it, and there's another log in this one that's the length of it. And then all of the trimmings from those logs went around it to make a nice nest. And then a lot of compost and regular native soil and so forth. But as long as I was doing annual culture, for the first couple years it was fine, because there was plenty of tied up nitrogen in the soil and the manure and so forth. Once that nitrogen got used, then the bed started to go, sink in towards the logs, and there wasn't enough matter in the soil to hold the bed together. So as I started putting perennials in there, the bed started to revive itself, because it has, root matter and decaying roots and enlivened roots and so forth. So this one is 10 years old, I bet.
How high was it when you started?
Probably another 2 feet, maybe.
Okay.
Yeah, so it sank down. This one is essentially the same as it has always been. So when you have the time, this is quite a diverse bed, all of them. It's quite diverse in what it's decided to do with itself. And so take some time to just peek in. And I'm adding a few things this year also.
What are the tall plants in that?
These?
Yeah.
This is marshmallow. The root is what we use. Yeah, and there's some pretty obvious and familiar ones in here, and then there's some ones that aren't so familiar too. So loosely what I'm going to be covering with you all is how do we keep this all alive, fertilized, enlivened, continually regenerating itself if I don't bring in outside fertilizer. Okay? So the first place we're going to go over here is to the compost pile, of course. So I just pulled this out. It was, as I pulled it out, 130. 130. This is a approximately week-old compost pile, right? Is that how we made it? Yeah. It's about a week old. What's in it is mostly cow manure and woody material. Any woody material. There's a little bit of fruit in it. Old pears that came out of the root cellar. But it's mostly woody material, old prunings from the garden, and cow manure. There's a little bit of chicken in it. And so the way that the compost rotation occurs here is that in the spring, the compost is made from the winter manure from the cows. So the winter manure gets collected as things start to warm up. It's brought here, and then everything that was pruned last fall out of the garden, woody materials, branches, leaves, straw, any mulch, that all gets piled in here all winter. And so those two things come together as a winter gesture. And this particular compost now is heated to about 140 yesterday. Now it's down to 130, which I'm happy about. I don't want compost any higher ever than 140, because biodynamic compost needs to be made with the bacteria that are the happiest at about 100 to 105. Otherwise, it burns up the nutrition that we want, and it's too cold. It's too hot. Thermophilic bacteria are the kind that are wanting to be in the heat and make heat. And those thermophilic bacteria are short-lived, so they don't really last the length of a static pile. Mesophilic bacteria occur at a much lower temperature. Those are the ones that generally make cheese. So mesophilic bacteria are the dominant bacteria I want, because thermophilic bacteria in these alkaline soils create a bacterial dominance. And that's not what we want in these soils. We want a fungal dominance as much as possible. And there's some tricks to doing that I'll teach you a little later. So the trick with biodynamic compost is I first make it with a product called Pfeiffer Compost Starter when I'm layering it. And that's so that I can add moisture and add some starter bacteria that are very friendly to biodynamic preparations. After it reaches 140, for a length of time, 2 to 3 days, I turn the whole thing over and mix everything together that was layered in. I might even add some more ingredients if I feel like it needs some oomph. After I do that, I let it come back up to temperature one more time, sometimes 2 more times if it feels like it's just really in that heating cycle. Once it's come up to temperature 1 or 2 more times, I turn it finally, and then I poke holes in it and put the traditional biodynamic preparations in it. I cover it, I put a skin on it, and I let it sit there. It may be ready for crops that like, really young compost in 6 to 8 weeks, but I would much prefer it sits there for almost 6 months. And at that period of time, then after that, in the fall, that goes on the fields. So what went on the fields just recently is the different gesture, which is the spring compost. Okay? So it's a fall, spring rotation of composts.
So where does the spring material come from?
The spring material that's kind of like a misnomer. It's actually the fall material. It comes from the whole summer.
Okay.
Yeah. The greenish, really green.
Just weed it or whatever.
Yep.
Okay.
All the weeds, all the seeds, all the grasses, all the really young manure that's out in the fields, all of that stuff, that goes into the spring pile, which is actually the end of summer, fall pile. Okay. So this is the heart of the fertility, clearly. It's 2 big compost piles. Now, one might say, ooh, that doesn't look like very much compost for this place. It's plenty. Plenty. It goes on that thick. You use very little of it. It's basically homeopathic compost. So you don't use a lot of it. Okay? So now we're going to go in the barn so we can get out of the wind and hear each other a little bit better. So basically what I do to augment my compost regime is a lot of fermenting of particularly useful herbs here on the farm. The 3 most useful herbs that I use here are comfrey, nettle, and horsetail. All 3 of those get fermented into what we call liquid manures. Now, nettle, I would say, turns most into a manure. It is really stinky. It takes about 2 weeks to make a batch. It works phenomenally well for drought-stressed or plants that need a little bit of a boost of iron in the form of chlorophyll. However, when you make nettle ferment, it's not like pouring nettle tea onto plants. You must dilute it. If you don't dilute it, it will be way too strong and it will burn your plants. Okay, so nettle gets diluted 1 to 10, nettle manure. Okay, now I've started a batch of nettle manure about 3 days ago, and you can see kind of its character has changed. It's not smelly to the point yet, but it is starting to decompose, and you can smell it as it starts to decompose. But it's going to accentuate itself probably 10 times. By the time I take this out of here, you will not want to put your fingers in it. It's really stinky. And I put it in stem and all, and the leaves completely decompose, and all I have left is stems, and that's how I know it's done.
And how full was that with plant material before you added water?
About 3/4 full.
So pretty much the same as where it is right now.
Pretty much, yeah. And so,
And I'm sorry, how much would that cover?
oh, a lot. You know, when I get finished and I strain everything out, you know, I'll still have at least a half a bucket full, and I dilute it 1 to 10.
Oh, okay.
So if I fill up a 4-gallon sprayer and it's diluted 1 to 10, I probably take about a half a cup of nettle, if that.
Okay.
Yeah. So 1 to 10 is the dilution. If you keep it in the sunlight, it will decompose quite a bit faster. If you keep it in the shade, it will take a little bit longer and perhaps be a little more complete in its decomposure. So in the summertime, if I have the luxury of putting it in the sunlight or in the shade, I do. But in general, I don't, because everything is moving and growing, and so I need it. So this is pretty much my main ferment for nutritional boosting of plants whenever they particularly need it. Then the other one that is a really amazing ferment is horsetail. Now, horsetail is officially a biodynamic preparation all by itself. So when we use horsetail as a fresh tea in spraying in an atmospheric spray, then it is considered one of the traditional biodynamic preparations. When we use it this way, the main advantage to this is that you use less. I really want you to smell it because it is very characteristic, okay? A very characteristic sulfur smell is what you get when you ferment horsetail. Now, the sulfur is the key. The sulfur in our soils, the sulfur process, not the element sulfur, but the sulfur process, in other words, how the earth uses sulfur, okay, in the soil. The sulfur process in the alkaline soils is what you are able to use to adjust the balance of pH in our alkaline soils. And there are certain ways you can get sulfur. One of them is fermenting a very silica-rich plant like horsetail. Another one is fermenting yarrow. Yarrow also is very high in sulfur process, not sulfur element, and it will definitely heat like sulfur would heat. So in other words, the sulfur that you smell in the atmosphere, that is the process that we're talking about with either horsetail or yarrow, okay? So fermented horsetail, you use about 1/3 of the amount that you would normally need to use in a biodynamic spray of fresh horsetail. In general, I use the horsetail that's fermented on the ground, not on the leaves. And I use the non-fermented fresh horsetail as an atmospheric spray overhead and let the droplets fall down. Horsetail is the one plant in nature that has the highest silica content on Earth. And the throwback in earlier Paleolithic times is that horsetail was as tall as a tree, big tree, and it was the food for the dinosaurs. Now, you can see it down by my stream. I think it's up. Its height is this tall. It almost maybe gets to this tall at the most in the summertime. And that's a healthy horsetail plant now, which is, just an indication of the vitality of the earth and what it's been producing with regards to its use of silica over its evolution. It's decreased, decreased, decreased. The silica content in the plant, however, has increased, increased, increased. So the plant silica that's in horsetail is a much more gentle version of silica for plants. Our plants actually need silica. It's a very little known nutrient, but it's quite valuable. Silica gives you uprightness. It's very good for us, for our hair, our bones, our nails, etc. And the same is true for plants. It's utilized by the plants in making themselves upright. And it's also used by the plants in photosynthesis. Whenever a plant is taking in silica, what that silica is saying is, here's the light from the sun, magnified on crystals of silica, to tell you to go ahead and ripen, to be fructifying, to come to completion. In other words, to make yourself full archetypically and die. So we spray silica in the middle of summer all the way until harvest to encourage plants to go ahead and come to fruition. That includes grains, fruits, any kind of vegetable that has a fruit to it, like beans and peas, berry fruits, pretty much anything that you want to have come to fruition. If you spray silica on it, either the horsetail version or the version that's made from quartz crystals, which is the other biodynamic preparation, it will encourage that plant to go ahead and complete its cycle, be full of nutrition, sugars, increases the sugars dramatically in plants, and that's its main purpose for us to use. So silica in horsetail is a very gentle form of silica, and it's not nearly as powerful as the quartz silica. So I use a lot of silica in horsetail. The other thing that is very unique to horsetail silica is that the fermented horsetail has almost as many beneficial fungi in it as can be found anywhere on the planet. This was a study that was done probably about a decade and a half ago. So we're talking about using a fungal-based organismic tea, and what that does is it aids fungal organisms in reproducing that are beneficial, and it replaces fungal organisms that are non-beneficial. So the other really main use for silica is a quelling of a fungal tendency for plants. The way that it does that, though, is kind of counterintuitive. What it does is produces lots and lots and lots of beneficial fungal organisms to replace the ones that are causing mold and rot and so forth. Okay?
Kind of pushes them out of the...
Pushes them out because it takes receptors up on the plant surface and gives that beneficial fungal organism, both on the plants and in the ground.
That's the fermented,
Not the atmospheric spray so much. Although I would say that the atmospheric spray does balance watery conditions.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So if you lived in Oregon, you might use a lot of horsetail silica, fresh horsetail as silica.
Right.
Yeah. But if you lived in Oregon, you might want to balance it with a just even more powerful silica in the form of 501, which is quartz silica. Yeah.
What's the dilution for
So with the fermented, you use, again, a 1 to 10, or you can go as little as 1 to 5, but you really probably don't need to, okay? If you're using it, as a preparation in the form that was discussed in biodynamics, then you use about 1.5 to 2 cups of silica fermented per 3 gallons of water, and that covers an acre. So that gets stirred in vortex fashion for about 20 minutes, and that enlivens it homeopathically. So it changes the dynamic of the solution. When I use this, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, in compost tea, I don't stir it vortex-wise when I add it, only at the end and only for a little while. Okay? So that's my next second ferment that I make. I've always got it hanging around. I even keep it in the wintertime. But I usually keep it in glass in the wintertime so that it's a little bit less tending to take up any of the residue from the plastic. I'm going to use this up this summer, and I just made it, and so I don't worry about it.
I'm wondering about dried equisetum and dried nettles.
Dried versus fresh?
Well,
Yeah. I think that dried in the nettle ferment would make it be a little more difficult to actually break way down, because the action of what's on the plants as they're growing, all the yeasts, all the bacteria, all the fungals that are present on a live nettle plant is what really aids in the fermentation. Same with horsetail. But boy, try to get fresh horsetail, except between June and August up here, and no go. So almost always I'm using dried. Yeah, except in the summer when it's fresh on the stream. Yeah. Okay. Now the third one that I use a lot is comfrey. So what I haven't put the water in this yet because I wanted you to see. In the spring, you can make comfrey ferment with the leaves and the flowers because it's starting to bloom. And the flowers actually have, as strong as the leaves, medicinal properties, particularly when they're fermented in sugar. So I start this with just this amount. I don't really put any more in here than this. And it's probably a 2, maybe 3 or 4 to 1 dilution of flowers to leaves. And then just to get the fermentation process going a little bit faster, I douse it with some brown sugar. Now, you can do the same kind of thing, which is part of the Korean farming approach, with the flowers alone. And you can just put the flowers in a jar and then put some brown sugar on it and twist the lid on, not absolutely tight because it'll blow up sometimes, but putting it on tight enough that, the decomposition of the flowers is occurring in the jar. It will take about a week to 10 days, and then you'll have this really nice syrup. Okay? Comfrey flower syrup. It's called fermented plant juices in Korean farming methodology. They have a whole big range of stuff that you can do with Korean farming. It's very, very much more complex. But at any rate, what I've started to do is use a little bit of Korean farming and a little bit of fermentation mentality of herb ferments. And I find that it's really a balanced ferment. Whereas just using the leaves before, it wasn't quite as strong. But with the flowers and the sugar, it's a little bit stronger ferment. It lasts a little longer on the soil before it's used up by the plants. And the reason we use comfrey is that I actually think comfrey should be in biodynamic preparation, by the way. I just don't know how to make it yet because it was never indicated. But comfrey is such an amazing plant. I mean, it is prolific. If you ever have it, you will never get rid of it. Its roots are, just this really amazing fibrous yet soft material. The leaves can make oil that is phenomenal for massage, for any kind of aches, pains. Its other common name is bone knit. So it can be utilized. It's through the skin and into your bones to help you make a broken bone heal. So you can imagine the amount of material, mineral material that's in comfrey. It's quite remarkable. So as it ferments, what I use it for is remineralization of plants. Now, usually on our soils here, the mineral content is very high. It's not a problem. It's unlocking it that's the problem. So between nettle ferment and comfrey, that is the unlocking of minerals in the soil. Okay, yeah.
You said there's oil content in the leaves. Do you distill the leaves?
No, I make oil out of the leaves. So I tincture the leaves in oil.
Oh.
Yeah, and make a comfrey oil. It's a beautiful oil. It's bright, bright green. And it's really nice paired with St. John's wort oil or or nettle oil. You can use it, or arnica oil.
So do you macerate the leaves?
Macerate the leaves for 4 to 6 weeks or less. It just depends on how quickly it needs to macerate down.
And what oil do you like?
I like almond oil myself. I like it on my skin, but you can use any oil that you like. Grapeseed oil you can use. There's a little bit of a who knows about grapeseed oil as far as its manufacture. But almond oil, you can get pretty high quality almond oil. Sunflower oil is really nice also. It's pretty clear oil. So you can do that with comfrey too.
Thank you.
So this, I just haven't turned into the ferment yet. But I'll put water into this and probably a little more plant material. And then it'll ferment down just like this. It won't get nearly as stinky, but it will deteriorate, and you'll be able to tell when the leaves are starting to deteriorate. As you stir it, they'll just fall off, whatever it is that you're stirring it with. And the brown sugar just gives the bacteria something to grow on, is all. You could use yucca, you could use molasses, you could use maple syrup. Yeah, you could use pretty much anything. You could use honey, but I never have. But you could try it. You could try it. This probably ferments again for about 2 weeks. And then its dilution, again, this is 10 to 1 until you figure out that it's okay to use it. You can probably go down to 5 to 1 on comfrey ferment. Okay? So I cover everything when it's fermenting. I've definitely had ferments be inoculated by critters that I don't really want in there, worms and caterpillars and things like that. Okay, and also in nettle culture, there's one single black worm, and it only bothers nettle. It doesn't bother any other plant. And it's pretty prolific. And if you have it and you start fermenting nettle, even if it's in egg form, it'll start hatching in your ferment. And I have had nettle ferment that's just roiling with caterpillars. Yeah, just roiling with them. I just strain them out, put them in the compost pile. They're going to go down like everything else. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is compost tea. So I have a distinct advantage as far as making compost tea that a lot of people don't have, and that is barrel compost. So I encourage you all, at some point I will give a workshop about making barrel compost. It's extremely easy to make. Everybody should make it. It's like having a biodynamic compost pile that you've tended for 6 to 8 months in a homeopathic dilution. So when you make a barrel compost, you make it in a pit that's about yay big and about yay deep. And you have enough of that material to cover 3,000 acres before you're all done with it and have to make it again. So it is quite concentrated. It's a fabulous thing to make. I really encourage it. And I'm almost out of mine, so I'm probably going to have to make some more. So I'm going to pass this around. This is barrel compost. It's really fabulous stuff. Ooh, I might run out. I'll have to make some copies if I'm out. You make it with 25 gallons of cow manure, 5 5-gallon buckets, stirred for an hour. Stir the cow manure for an hour. While you're stirring it, you add basalt rock, ground basalt rock, and ground eggshells. That's it. Put it in a pit.
What kind of ground rock?
Basalt. Why? Basalt is the parent rock. So in Hawaii, when the volcanoes finish their molten state, it's basalt that they turn into. It's parent rock. It is the youngest rock on the planet. And not only is the youngest rock on the planet, but it also can morph into other rock. It's that magical. So basalt, for sure. Now you can add other things into barrel compost that isn't on this sheet, and those kinds of things can be horsetail, right on top. You can add nettle. Some people think that's very beneficial. Personally, I have added horsetail, and I do think that that's pretty beneficial because it's pretty low on the silica end of things. Now, when you make the barrel compost and you put it in the pit, the way that the barrel compost is finished and made into barrel compost other than just a pit of manure is you add 2 sets of biodynamic compost preparations. One in the middle, and then the rest of the manure, and then another one on the top. And you finish it with valerian. So I've put my valerians out here for you guys to sample smell. Valerian is like a wine, really. It's a fermented product. We use the flowers. Today we're probably going to make some tincture out of the roots. That's normally what people use valerian for. But in biodynamics we use the flowers. And the flowers then are picked on a flower day, on an ascending moon in the summer, and they are clipped very closely so that their stems are not part of what you get. They're fermented in spring water for a period of maybe a day, just so the spring water is absorbed into the flowers. Then they're ground using anything you have. You can use a squeezo, you can use a food processor, you can use a blender, whatever you have. You grind up the flowers and you put them in a jar and you let them ferment. You don't need to add water, you just put them in a jar and you let them ferment. And they will decrease over about 2 weeks. And what you'll find is there'll be a sediment at the bottom. You decant the juice of the valerian flowers off of that sediment. Throw the sediment away or in the compost pile. And what you get then at the end is this very dark, kind of wine-like preparation. Valerian is the finishing of all compost. So when this compost pile gets finally turned, it will get sprayed with valerian in a homeopathic dilution. Valerian adds warmth. So getting familiar with valerian as an herb is really important because it's super versatile. You can use the root as a straight up medicinal tinctured in alcohol about the strength of vodka for sleep and for pain. So it's a very potent nervine. It's also, though, a very potent homeopathic biodynamic preparation if you use the flowers. There is some anecdotal evidence that flowers also have the same homeopathic action as the roots, so they can be given more safely to children. And they have less of a tendency to push you into a depressive mode. Sometimes valerian root tincture can push you into a depression mode if you take it too long, too frequently. So the flowers are quite nice. It's like a flower remedy. You can actually make a flower remedy by putting the flowers in sunlight in a little bit of spring water and letting that spring water absorb the flower energy. So it's like an energy medicine. This way that we're making it, it has the quality of warmth. As we're fermenting it and it's getting down into a concentrated way, when we spray this, either in a homeopathic dilution or vortex stirred as we do with biodynamics, when we spray it in a greenhouse in the wintertime, it will assist those greenhouse plants in creating warmth conditions so that you can actually grow a lot more cold hardy lettuces, kales, mizunas, spinach, whatever. You can also treat your seeds with it before you put it in. So you can soak your seeds in a 1 to 10 dilution of stirred valerian, and that will be enough for the seeds to get the intelligence that they should grow in a condition of warmth. A friend of mine in Taos, New Mexico, gardens at about this altitude, maybe even a little higher. And she's a market gardener, grows greens in the winter, and grows them in a greenhouse uncovered because of valerian treatment. So my recipe for compost tea is a little bit on the advantage side because I always use it with barrel compost. So I put about a heaping tablespoon of barrel compost in the bottom of a 5-gallon bucket. I add about half a cup of oats. I add about a teaspoon of yucca. Yucca is just a really nice saponin, and it helps for the fungal balance to shift more towards a fungal characteristic of compost tea. I put in about 2 drops to 4 drops of valerian. I put about a half a cup of fermented horsetail tea. I then put the rest up, put the water up to the top, almost to the top, and then I put an aquarium pump in it for about 1 to 2 days. Now, sometimes if you have really fresh yucca, it'll foam too much. So sometimes I add the yucca after it's been under the pump for, 12 to 14 hours. Then add the yucca. If you don't mind the foam, put the yucca in at the beginning. The oat and yucca combination, the oat yucca horsetail tea combination is what makes the fungal balance that we want in compost tea. Most compost tea that you would buy around here that's being made around here does have a little bit more of a balanced approach to bacterial and fungal. I want fungal. I have highly alkaline soils up here, and the fungal balance is crucial to get mycorrhizae in my soil. So I want that. But you can certainly do a balanced compost tea as well. Okay? And that is the program of fertility up here. That is it. Okay? I never use raw manure on anything, ever. Never. Because it's not gone through anything that has a resemblance to life, to death, and back to life. Regular manure, fresh out of the cow, should only go in barrel compost. It should never go straight on your ground to fertilize anything. Even kind of rotted manure really needs to be composted first before you use it. There's many reasons that organics thinks that way as well because of pathogenic microorganisms. But my feeling of it is a little bit different than that, and it has to do with the forces that are in that manure needing to go through a rebirth. So it comes out alive, it goes through a composting process, which is a fermentation process, and it comes back alive in the compost. Okay. If it didn't do that, it would miss that middle part, and that would be unfortunate. It's a much more powerful. So, like a lot of people make cow manure tea. A lot of people do that. I don't, for those reasons. Yeah, I think it's a little bit too physical to a spirit, to the life body. It's a combination of the spirit, of the life body and the physical body. It doesn't take in the entire aspect of us being physical, a life body, a spiritual body, and an astral body that goes out into the cosmos. That's what happens in the composting process of cow manure. So, all right.
Compost tea, you spray topically, or do you do soil drench with it?
I do both, a foliar and I dilute it about 1 to 5, 1 to 10. It's not as crucial for the dilution of compost tea, because compost tea, the ingredient components of compost tea, as it's brewed, as it's oxygenated, it's probably not necessarily as strong as, say, a nettle ferment or even a horsetail ferment. Yeah. And that's pretty much the program, yeah.
Opportunities outside of cow manure, I have access to camelin manure.
Yeah. Yeah. So as far as using camelid manure, the very best way that animals digest is with as many stomachs as can be available to them. So the ruminants have 4. Camelids have 2? 2, yeah. So the very best enlivening of the forces of the planet that they're taking in and eating come from 4 stomachs. But for sure, I used to have goats up here a lot, and I used goat manure, and it made an adequate compost, I would have to say. The goat and chicken combination was the best. Chicken manure for our soils as an addition. Now that's the one manure that I will put on straight. What I do with it is not straight, it's dried. What I do with it is on top of a root crop that's planted all winter, such as garlic or shallots, I will sprinkle on chicken manure and then straw, and it just balances the phosphorus depletion that we have in our soils just enough, just enough. And I add a little bit of it to my compost pile, chicken manure. Chicken manure gets a bad rap, because it's hot. It's also, the reason it's hot is because it uses the air. It's an airy creature, and it's hot in that way because it's, but it's not really that bad of a thing as long as you treat it properly and don't put it on straight. Yeah. So I put it on in the fall actually, and let it winter over. And then it does a very fine job of fertility. Okay. We should probably, yep, we're just on time, actually. Questions?
Can I ask you about the comfrey ferment? When do you apply that and how do you apply it?
I apply it just the same as I do the nettle ferment. You can apply it foliarly or as a ground drench. And I apply it mostly when I feel like the plant is not utilizing minerals that it could be using from the soil itself as efficiently as it should. So let's say that in the middle of summer and it's really hot and you've got squash that's just kind of sitting there. It's not really putting on flowers. It's growing. It has liveliness. It's growing, but it's not going forward because it doesn't have all of the mineral components that it needs to make flowers, to make fruit, to make vining. The squashes do best when they've got vines everywhere, right? So it's not doing that. If you give it comfrey and horsetail, it will get the message that all of those things need to be present. Similarly with nettle, I use nettle all the time. The ferment all the time. I mean, there's nothing that I would say that's a contraindication to using nettle, except if you've got, mold or, such prolific, green growth that you want to put the stops to it. The stop is the horsetail. So that's why these things are such a nice triad. There's a couple more that I use that are specific for bugs. Nasturtium ferment is excellent for aphids. Same thing, ferment it, get it gooey. It stinks, big time. No, just the leaves. Just the leaves. It's excellent for aphids. In a greenhouse in the early spring. So I do grow nasturtiums in my greenhouse for that very purpose, just to have it around so that I can use it for that. And you'll notice in this greenhouse, I have my coveted nettles that are, they look like giant whatevers. Nobody grows nettles like that. And they're wild, right? But I cultivate them because I need them all the time. And in my greenhouse, I actually allow a space in my other greenhouse, for comfrey. I allow a space for lemon balm, and I allow a space for nasturtium. And they get that space permanently in there so that I can always have that medicine to use and I'm not without.
And the lemon balm is for?
The lemon balm is really more for winter sadness. I love lemon balm in the wintertime. And so its medicinal qualities in the wintertime are kind of what keep me on the other side of being seasonally effective by the lack of sunlight. Yeah, good question. Yeah, because it will take over. So you do have to kind of be, hey, enough. Yeah, enough. Okay. One other thing. This is what the biodynamic preparation of nettle is like. So to make the biodynamic preparation of nettle, we take nettle, gobs and gobs of it, and we put it in like a pillowcase material, like a game bag. Have you ever seen those stretchy big things? We chop it all up. Some people put the stems in, some people don't. We chop it all up and we pack it really, really tightly into something that won't deteriorate in the ground. It goes straight into the ground. Preferably in a place where you have some fertility, like maybe putting peat in there. It gets buried for a year, and from pounded up green nettles mushed into a bag, you get this at the end. It's a colloid, so if you put it in between your fingers, it should smear like that. And that is nettle preparation. Different than the nettle ferment, different than nettle tea. It goes in the compost pile. It is the heart of the compost pile. It is best for circulation of nutrients in the compost pile, and it goes straight in the middle of the compost pile for that reason.
So that's what you put on your first layer when you were layering?
When I layer it at the end, and I put 6 holes in the compost pile,
Oh, at that point.
it goes in the middle.
Okay.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some other time we'll go through making a biodynamic compost pile. It's really fun to do that. It's the best compost you'll ever make. It comes out like chocolate cake. Literally like chocolate cake. Literally like that thing I passed around. Yeah, it looks just like that, if it's well made. You don't get to have that privilege every year. The gods have to shine on you, but when you do, it's like gold. You keep it for a long time. Other questions? Okay, I'm going to go ring the bell and we're going to rotate. Thanks, guys.